Hello, everyone. Welcome back to All Creatures Podcast. I'm Angie, and today we're heading into the muddy world of a small but mighty creature, the crayfish. Whether you call them crayfish, crawdads, these crustaceans are vital to freshwater ecosystems, especially in the diverse waterways of the American Southeast and Appalachia. Joining me today is biologist and crayfish expert Dr. Zachary Graham, author of the new book, Crayfish, Crawfish, and Crawdads, The Biology and Conservation of North Americans' Favorite Crustaceans. And Zachary is an expert on these fascinating creatures, and today he will take us on a journey through streams, springs, and roadside ditches to reveal how these colorful and adaptable animals help shape our environment and why they urgently need our protection. Hopefully, after this interview today, you too will be an advocate and an enthusiast for all things crawfish. So, hello, Zachary.
Hey, how's it going? Thank you for having me.
Oh my gosh, I am so glad you're here today because Chris and I have been doing this podcast for a long time. I think almost close to 7 or 8 years now. And we have not covered a crawfish on podcast. So I'm excited to learn a ton today. I'm sure our listeners are as well. And yeah, and we'll touch on your book and just, it's going to be great. I have my tea right here. So I'm hoping you spill the tea on all the secrets of these cool little creatures. So thank you for being here today. And before we get started, I was hoping, I was hoping you can give our listeners a little background about yourself. Did you always love nature, love animals? Has it always been crayfish for you? Is that your favorite animal? I want to know. So, what's a little bit about your history?
Yeah, so I grew up outside of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. And so outside of,
Steel
the
Town.
major, yeah, yep, Steel City,
uh,
City of Bridges. So I grew up, in a pretty suburban type environment. But I always loved animals. I was one of those types of kids that would just catching animals my entire life. It's what I thought life was all about when I was younger. And I really just have always enjoyed that. I never really knew you could be a biologist. I didn't know that that was a career field. So it's not like it was something that I necessarily have always wanted to be because I didn't think that that was an option for me. But I actually, been catching these animals my entire life. Later, ended up getting involved in research when I was getting my psychology degree, actually, undergraduate degree in psychology, but it was during that I met a biologist for the first time. And the second I took a non-majors biology class, I knew that that's what I needed to do. And so really like the rest of my life, I just knew that animals, biology, nature, I needed to learn about it, teach people about it. Eventually I ended up going to Arizona State University for a PhD program. And that's kind of where I came back to crayfish. I came back to the animals that I hadn't really thought about in a scientific way ever,
mm,
but I just figured they're a really good system and I was kind of familiar with them. So I like kind of just set my eyes on studying them. Um, and, you know, 10 years or so later, kind of here we are, think about them every day. They're my favorite thing to talk about.
Ooh, they're your favorite thing to talk about, but are they your favorite animal?
Definitely. Yeah. Yeah. I mean,
Awesome.
it's hard to pick which one because there's so many different types, as I'm sure we'll talk about. But yeah, they're definitely my favorite animal. I have many tattoos actually of animals, like 10 or so. They were my second one, but it's my favorite tattoo is my crayfish tattoo.
That's awesome. And so, what is your academic background and your current role at West Liberty University?
Yeah, so I'm an assistant professor of biology at West Liberty University. It's a smaller public school about an hour west or so of Pittsburgh. It's in the northern panhandle of West Virginia. So this school has been kind of an hour away from me my entire childhood. I didn't really know it existed until I was looking for jobs and whatnot. But it's a great environment that actually has another crayfish expert, Dr. Zach Loafman. So it's like kind of cool. We're kind of like a tag team of crayfish biologists, and we can do way more with the resources that we have here. So it's an amazing place to study these animals.
Yeah, the Zacks. I love that.
Yep. Yep.
And so, with your research and your interest during your PhD in crayfish, was there like an aha moment of okay, I'm just in love with these guys. I got to keep studying them because I will say for anybody that's from either the master's level or PhD anywhere in grad school, you have to really love what you study because you go so in depth and so detail oriented that you have to truly be passionate about what you're studying. And so I'm just wondering if there was that click moment with crayfish.
Yeah. So for me, like I mentioned, my undergraduate degree was in psychology. I did biology research,
Hmm.
um, but I actually got into a PhD program with the intentions of studying humans and kind
Ah,
of like evolutionary sports science was the goal. Like I was trying to take evolutionary theory and apply it to sports and learn about how we can optimize behaviors and, whatever sport it may be. That was my initial kind of goal, what I was recruited for. I ended up hating that. I spent a year or so reading about this and I hated it. And I
I
came
don't
to a
I
point.
don't love that you hate it, but I love this story. So
Yeah,
please keep going because it's so important for our listeners to hear this. So okay. So
yeah,
you're in it, you like signed up for this really hard thing to do and you're doing it for a year and you hate it and then
yeah, I had no idea what I was gonna do. I knew I did not like what I was reading about. I couldn't see myself conducting this type of research. And so what I ended up doing is I essentially just told my advisor, like, I'm not loving this. I need to think of something else. I don't know exactly what I'm gonna do. I had a few ideas. Some of them, looking back on them, were hilariously bad. Just like no substance whatsoever, but that's kind of the way you have to start out. And my PhD advisor, actually, as a fun side project, studied crayfish fighting behavior with his buddy in Australia. They went to Australia and they studied these cool species and tried to figure out how they were fighting and why they were fighting and things like that, which is a normal behavior for a crayfish. They do it every day. And I was like thinking about it, and I knew that I had some experience as a kid catching crayfish or crawfish, same thing generally. And I just thought, like, what if I continued on that line of research, looking at crayfish behavior? Um, and so that's kind of like, once I had that thought, I actually started learning that there was a crayfish society. It's called the International Association of Asticology. And asticology is the fancy term for crayfish biology. And the crazy thing was, it was in 2018. They have a meeting every 2 years. That meeting was in Pittsburgh, where I was from. And so it had
oh
only
yeah.
been in the United States like 3 times ever. But the year that I decided to study crayfish, there was a meeting in my hometown at the museum I went to my entire life, the Carnegie Museum of Natural History. And once I got there, I knew that that was my community. I knew that these were the type of people I want to be like. These are the type of people that I want to learn from. It was really kind of like the second I got there, I was like, I really am, I was confirmed that that was the right decision and that, it was worth the risk of dropping my old projects and whatnot.
Oh, yeah, so serendipitous, right? Like, but I appreciate that so much because I have students come to me all the time and they think they're supposed to be on this certain track and they're not sure if it's the right track and they, and I guess I maybe thought this too, that you're supposed to be on this super linear path that just keeps going up with no speed bumps and when there is a speed bump, it can be super scary. And I just try to always share with them that I know very few people in my life that had perfect a perfect track record of saying I want to be a kindergarten teacher, and then they're a kindergarten teacher, and that does happen, and that's wonderful when that happens. But I feel like the more people I talk to and meet that are either researchers or wildlife biologists or conservationists or in academia, that the path looked a little bit more like bumpy and not super linear, and that's okay because you really want to if you're you really want to make sure that you're on the right track and in love with what you study, especially if you're going to be out in the field, getting wet, being cold, in the lab, up late reading. Like you said, you're bored reading that. That's not going to work out if you're going to be reading about this topic for the rest of your life. So I just really appreciate you sharing that story because it's close to my heart because mine was very similar. It just was kind of like, I always say a lot of times life is figuring out the things you don't like, right? Like I don't want to be out in the field 24/7, or I don't want to be in a lab 24/7, and then just kind of then putting, or whatever it is for the individual, and then putting the pieces together, and that's okay. There's nothing wrong with you. It's part of the process, and I think as you figure out more of those pieces about yourself in your career, I think it makes you a stronger professional in whatever you do, right? So thank you for sharing. I
Yeah.
appreciate that. And now, Zachary, you touched on it a little bit in your last answer, but can you just quick tell us if there is a difference between crayfish, crawdad, crawfish? What what terminology should we use, and does it really matter?
Yeah. So crayfish, crawfish, crawdad, mudbug, ditch
Mud bug, yeah.
cricket,
Uh-huh.
lawn lobster, yabby. These are all terms for the same animal, the little freshwater lobsters. They're in the same kind of group that the lobsters are, but lobsters are marine. They live in the ocean. And then all these crayfish, these are all freshwater organisms. And so they have all these different names. They're just different dialects. Generally, it's where you're from. I'm from the Northeast. Generally, that's crayfish. If you're from the Southeast, it's definitely going to be crawfish. If you're from the West, sometimes crawdad. Um, in the scientific study of them, we call them crayfish generally.
Okay.
Uh, and so there's like a kind of saying that all the asticologists have. It's if you're studying them, it's crayfish. If you're eating them, it's crawfish. And if you're fishing with them, using them as fishing bait, then it's crawdad. But then
Interesting.
there's also a bunch of different names for them. If I'm talking about eating them, I don't say, "Oh, have you ever eaten a crayfish?" I say, "Have you eaten a crawfish?" Because that's kind of the cultural and local dialect that they would use when you're talking about consuming them. And so it's all the same thing, but generally we call them crayfish. That's kind of my default is calling them
Okay.
crayfish.
Well, and that makes sense for me because I'm from Michigan, so that would probably fall more into the crayfish dialect there. So okay, great, awesome. Now you also describe crayfish as being more than just boring brown bugs under rocks. So, what are a few mind changing or mind blowing facts about crayfish that you want every listener to know?
Yeah, so there's a lot of diversity within this group. When I was a kid, I spent most of my childhood thinking about animals like crayfish or catching crayfish. And every single one that I caught to me as a 8-year-old was just a little boring brown bug. And that's what everyone thinks because they generally just like flip a rock in a stream and they see a single species and they don't pay much attention to it. But in the United States, there's over 400 different species. There's over 700 globally, over 700 species globally, but over 400 or so in the United States.
So, the US
So,
is like a hot spot.
yeah, it's a global diversity hotspot. Southeastern United States and then southeastern Australia are actually the two kind of hotspots for crayfish diversity, which is very interesting. And so these animals, there's over 400 different species. And part of my research, part of why I love them so much is because of that diversity to kind of demonstrate they can be bright blue naturally, they can be bright red, they can be bright orange, all naturally, not through artificial breeding. They can be absolutely massive. They can be over a foot long, with some species getting that size. They can live in caves. They can live, hundreds of meters deep in a lake, very, very deep. They can live, um, really any type of environment they've adapted and evolved to. So, one of my favorite things is that actually near where I grew up, where I hiked and walked around in a park my entire life, there was a species of crayfish called the blue crawfish and it's bright blue. It's about this big. It's about 3 inches long, bright
So
blue,
cool.
but it lives
Yeah.
underground. And I never knew they existed. I never knew they existed until I was like, 20 years old or something like that, 21, 22. And so there's all these different types of crayfish that most people don't interact with because they're kind of very specialized. But there's so much diversity and cool stuff when you really pay attention to them. And that's what really excites me.
Well, now that you're flipping rocks over for a living and doing research and writing books about them, do you have like a fun or a cool story about being in the field with them?
Yeah, there's a lot. I would say when I go to places like Kentucky or Tennessee, these are kind of like the Amazon rainforests for crayfish. Like you go there and there's so many different types. There's so many different species. It's like overwhelming almost. And oftentimes you don't even know what you're looking at because it could be actually a species that's never been described. So I often get excited when I go to really diverse places, but it's taken me now I've gone snorkeling in Northern California for these organisms in beautiful crystal clear water. I've trudged through like Florida scrub habitat, almost desert like, searching for these animals. And so it kind of takes you everywhere because they've adapted to live in a lot of different places.
So cool. Yeah, it was really diverse where they live. That's so interesting.
Yeah.
And now, for our listeners that maybe aren't convinced that we should care about crayfish or that they're that cool, and we're going to dive more into some of their behavioral facts and their biology, but why else should people care about them as far as our waterways and them as a keystone species? So why else should we care?
Yeah. So these little crayfish, they're oftentimes one of the most abundant animals in the environment. So, like in a stream or a creek or a lake, they could be the most abundant, especially invertebrate that's there. So, not counting like the fish and the birds and whatnot. So, they're everywhere. What that often means is that they're getting consumed a lot. So, a lot of bigger organisms are eating them. If you care about the other wildlife, whether it's a bird, a snake, a frog, they are all consuming crayfish regularly. And then it's the same thing when you when you think about what crayfish are consuming, they consume everything. And so they'll eat anything in the environment. They will eat, sticks. They will eat leaves. They will eat other crayfish. They'll eat fish. They'll eat frogs. They'll eat anything they can get to. What that means is that they're really integrated into the food web and the ecosystems. And so that's one big reason to really care about them. One of the others is that crayfish are extremely good at creating little burrows, creating little cavities under rocks and even sometimes on land. And what that does is provides habitat for other organisms. So there's like tons of other animals that live in these crayfish burrows. It's the same kind of thing where you've heard of like a beaver. A beaver is like an ecosystem engineer. It creates the dam, which creates this beautiful habitat that lots of other animals rely on. Crayfish are doing the same thing, except there's way more crayfish and they are extremely abundant and lots of animals love living in their burrows. So I like to call them like the beavers without a backbone because they're invertebrates.
I love it. I love it. And you touched on there being 400 native species in North America alone. So, how did this continent and then Australia, across the globe, how did these two areas become global hotspots for crayfish?
Yeah, so that's a really interesting question. You have to go back very, very far in history, a few 100 million years. A lot of it, though, has to deal with mountains. And so throughout the eastern United States, this is kind of the hotspot in the United States for these organisms. That's where some of the most diverse freshwater habitats exist. And that's because of the Appalachian Mountains have developed throughout that range. And what it kind of does is it splits up the streams and it leads to different populations no longer being able to interact with one another. And then over time, they change and they adapt to their separate environments. And so oftentimes, whenever you see mountains, it leads to speciation, it leads to diversification. And if you look in the eastern portion, southeastern portion of Australia, they have mountain ranges running throughout there as well. And so it's a kind of similar type of story there.
Oh, that's so awesome. And really interesting too, because when you talk about like the different species, of course, and sizes of crayfish, Can you touch a little bit more on the color? I know in your new book, you definitely highlight this vivid color variation. So you mentioned the blues and the oranges. What, what, why is this color adaptation diversity? I understand with the mountains and things how they evolve and speciation happens, but then the color, because a lot of them are living underneath, like you said, rocks and in mud. And so, why is there such a diverse color and size as well across all these different species?
Yeah, that's a great question. And this is something that I think about a lot. And one of my favorite reasons to think about this is because we don't have a very clear, reassuring answer as to what explains all of this color diversity. What we do know is that most of the species that live in a creek, a lake, a stream, a river, a big body of water, most of them are camouflage colored. They're brown,
Okay.
they're tan, maybe a orangish hue if the rocks are orange. We think that they have evolved that color to blend in. But then there's these other species that I study a lot that are called burrowing species. And they still need fresh water, but they go on land and then they dig down to the fresh water. So that,
Interesting.
yeah, so
And
they go.
that's the one near you, right? In
Yeah,
Pittsburgh?
yeah, so that
Hmm.
blue one that I mentioned earlier, it goes on land, and then it digs down 1, 2, 3, sometimes 10 feet down until it
I
reaches the
see.
water, and
Okay.
that's where it gets its water, the groundwater, because if you dig
Oh,
really anywhere, eventually you're
yeah.
gonna hit water. And so what's really interesting is these burrowing species, they spend their entire lives in that burrow, underground, in the dark. Those are the species that are oftentimes brightly colored. So this is like a really interesting paradox. It's a really interesting evolutionary conundrum
Right.
because most of the time when animals evolve these bright colors, it's for something like sexual selection.
Yeah, to show
Yeah,
off. Yeah. Hmm.
exactly. Or something like aposematism or warning coloration, like a coral snake or a poison arrow frog. But we have no evidence that something like that's going on with these crawfish. And so it's really interesting. We don't have a great answer. One of the leading kind of hypotheses that I have proposed in my research is that maybe the color isn't adaptive. Maybe it actually has no function. Uh, Biologists are taught to investigate the function of different traits, but not all traits or colors are suspected to actually have a function. It doesn't have to be adaptive for it to persist and be maintained.
Sure. So interesting. And that leads me to another question, Zachary. How the heck do you find these things?
Yeah. Yeah, we know very little about these burrowing crayfish and their biology because it's so easy to collect them. It is or so difficult to collect them. It is
Yeah,
not as easy as flipping a rock and grabbing the little crustacean. What it
exactly. Yeah.
often involves is you need to dig them up. And so you need to find out where their habitat's at and you could like physically dig them up. That's pretty intensive though, because oftentimes
Yeah.
they can be like 3, 4 feet deep. It's not that easy. One of the most effective ways is to actually do what we call plunging. It's called burrow plunging. What you do is you find the burrow, there's like a little opening, like the size of a quarter, and then you kind of dig it open with your hands until you find the water. And
Okay.
then you stick your hand in that burrow. And what it does is it disturbs the water and you plunge it just like a plunger would in a toilet. And it disturbs the water even if it's 5 foot down. Even if the little crayfish is 5 foot down, the water gets sloshed around and then they run up and try to investigate what the heck's going on because you're kind of messing with their home a little bit. And that's oftentimes how you have to collect these species.
So interesting. I love it. But that's pretty field intense. So
Oh, very.
yeah, I just always thought of you in a stream, with the gators on and digging, flipping rocks and that type of water. But wow, that is so. And then they just live in the fresh water that's underground.
Exactly, yeah, so it could be imagine like a 3-foot pipe, and then at the very bottom of the pipe or the tunnel, that's where they have a little chamber, about the size of, like, bigger than a softball but smaller than a soccer ball, a small little
Okay.
chamber where the water actually just naturally occurs because they dug all the way down. And rainwater can also trickle down in there, and they just stay down there pretty much for everything. They probably forage down there. Maybe sometimes they'll come out to find a mate or to get some food, but it's pretty rare to see them outside of their burrow.
It's so interesting. Thank you for that visual. I love it. And now, you mentioned too at the beginning of the podcast about a colleague of yours studying how crayfish fight. And so, when it comes to uh, crayfish behavior, well, you just described a really cool one with the burrowing behavior. But when it comes to like behavior or any of their social interactions, are there any fun facts you could share with us about that?
Yeah, so crayfish behavior in most organisms' behavior, it's kind of determined based on their sensory systems. And so obviously we have different sensory systems. Humans have different sensory systems than a cat or a dog or a crayfish. The crayfish vision is reduced. They don't have very good vision. They have vision forming eyes. They can see things, but they don't have very good acuity. So they can't, make out very fine resolution and details in their environment, but they can definitely detect what's going on in their environment. What they often rely on is chemicals, essentially their sense of smell. And so what they do is they rely on these chemicals very heavily. One of the main ones that determines a lot of their behavior is actually in their urine. So crayfish and many crustaceans like crabs and lobsters and shrimps, they actually excrete urine to communicate with one another. And that sounds very strange, but if you think about your dog,
Mhm.
peeing on a tree stump or a stop
Sure.
sign, what they're doing is trying to communicate with any other dog that may or mammal that may walk by because in that urine it's kind of like their resume. You can sense based on the smell of that urine, is it a male dog, is it a female dog, is it a large dog, a small dog, is it stressed, is it pregnant? All of these different sources of information are in the urine. It's the same thing with the crayfish. So they actually spray out urine out of these two little glands on their face. And then the other crayfish uses their antenna or antennules and kind of smells it like their nose almost. And they can learn a lot about, their environment that way.
Oh, that is so interesting. I mean, just the visual on it alone, I can see the crayfish doing it, but if I put myself as a human in that situation, it seems like it'd be a little bit messy, but
Yeah.
it's so interesting, right? Any other like facts, like if I put myself into a crayfish body, any other senses of how, any other unique senses or behaviors of how they interact with their environment?
Yeah, well, they definitely rely on those chemicals a lot, which they can excrete, and then they can kind of smell or sense with these tiny little antenna that are in between their eyes. But
Hmm.
then because they're not blind, but they have poor vision. What they often rely on are their massive, larger antenna, which are kind of like walking sticks. They're kind of like a walking stick where they use it and survey their environment in front of them and they tap it around and they can feel the texture. They can feel how far away it is and kind of create a mental map. Crayfish have been
Hmm.
shown to make little mental maps essentially, and they'll follow them based on the information that they've received. So they're pretty intelligent, and their sensory systems are very unique. One of
Yeah,
the
and then
other things that they can do that I want to mention is that they can also taste by touching things. And so
yeah.
on their first pairs of walking legs, they have little taste receptors essentially. So you'll often find a little crayfish touching its environment with its first pairs of walking legs. And what it's doing is it's sensing like, is this food? Is this not food? Is there any other smells here that I should be, paying attention to? And so they're very kind of curious in that way.
Yeah, that's awesome. And that leads me into my next question is how do they capture their food? Is it through the taste or is it more through other senses?
Yeah, so crayfish, as I mentioned, they'll pretty much eat anything. They're
Yeah, that's really
opportunistic.
super
Yeah.
interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, we call them opportunistic omnivores. That means they'll eat anything whenever they can.
I think I
Yeah.
might fall into that category.
Yeah, yeah, definitely.
I'm moving. I'm trying to move more towards vegetarianism, but in general, I still will eat a little seafood. So, yeah, but definitely with my busy life and my kids, definitely opportunistic. I will pop one of their crackers into my mouth that's left over if I get the chance.
Yeah, the crayfish, they'll pretty much take anything they can get whenever they
Yeah,
can get it. So some
yeah.
of them will probably just kind of scavenge around. They'll scavenge and they'll consume a decaying carcass of whatever's in
Okay.
the stream. They'll just eat some leaves. They can sometimes even eat the sand because there's like little particles of nutrients on the sand and then they can filter that
Interesting.
out.
Yeah.
Yeah. But they're not predatory per se. They
Okay.
can act a little predatory, where some of the
Hmm.
burrowing species, for example, they'll sit at the top of their burrow and
Hmm.
they'll wait for something like a slug or a spider to run by and they'll grab it and pull it down in their burrow.
Got it.
They're kind of really unique in their foraging behavior, and they're very flexible as well.
Yeah, well,
Most of
that
them are
helps
very
to
flexible.
be able to adapt. And so, Zachary, that actually leads me into my next question a little bit. As far as you've noted that about half of North American crayfish species now require conservation attention, and there's probably ones that have gone extinct already. So, my first question is, what are the main drivers of this crisis, and what can we do about it?
Yeah, so many people, when they hear about conservation, when they hear about extinct animals, when they hear about endangered species, they think about like the textbook examples, whether
Yeah.
it's a tiger, a Sumatran tiger, or it's the giant panda, or the bald eagle, or the California condor. These are like prime examples of species that need conservation attention. What oftentimes gets forgotten are these little invertebrates, like the little crayfish, and these crayfish have been living in the United States or the continent of North America for a very long time. And they've evolved to kind of thrive in those environments. But obviously, what's happened in recent years is humans have came in and done a lot of things to the environment, many of them not that great. And so, what often happens is you'll see species that are declining in their populations because there's development nearby. A lot of these cities are built next to massive bodies of water. Pittsburgh is built at the base of the Ohio River where the Allegheny and the Monongahela meet. There's an obvious reason why humans have done that, but all of our construction, all of our natural resource extraction in those areas, it leads to worse water conditions, more polluted, unnatural conditions in those bodies of water where crayfish have been forever, essentially, millions, hundreds of millions of years. And so oftentimes humans are kind of messing up the environment. That's hurting the native species of crayfish. We also have lots of crayfish that are actually invasive. So they're
Oh, interesting.
introduced and moved outside of their native range, and that's being done, for example, for fishing bait. And so a fisherman catches some crawfish and then drives 2 hours. After he's using them as fishing bait, he'll just dump them in the stream. And then that can establish an invasive population that sometimes outcompetes the native population. And so that's a pretty big issue as well. So there's a whole
Interesting.
bunch of conservation issues generally in the realm of like anthropogenic stressors, so humans essentially exerting some type of pressure on the environment or moving species around are some of the biggest conservation issues with the crayfish in North America.
Well, yeah, and what does a better invasive species policy look like from a biologist perspective with crayfish?
Yeah, it's very tough because complete
Yeah,
elimination of invasive species or the complete stop of spread is not biologically realistic. Oftentimes what it relies on is education is one of them
yeah.
because
Okay.
people aren't doing this intentionally, and so education is really important. but also having pretty strict laws about purchasing or selling crayfish. Many states, it's illegal to own specific species or any species as a pet. And so that's a big one there. And oftentimes, education and those laws kind of both of them are needed to get the best form of protection, but it's a tough one to completely reduce, and it's a big deal in the United States. It's a really big deal over in Europe, where a lot of North American species have been spread over to Europe, and they're completely wiping out the native species over there. It's pretty disastrous.
Wow. So interesting. And with crayfish living in freshwater, can you touch on water conservation or water health, freshwater health in general, as far as obviously it was pristine before the Industrial Revolution, and then people came in and we did our thing. And then a lot of times we realize, oh boy, the water quality is horrific. Uh, and then we work towards fixing it. So in your opinion, where are we with our freshwater systems? At least here in North America, are they improving for our crayfish, or is there still a lot more work to be done?
Yeah, so it's kind of a mixed bag, I would say. Freshwater ecosystems are extremely important. Not only do, of course, humans drink and rely on fresh waters, but all of that water eventually makes its way into the ocean for the most part. And so a lot of the food resources, like seafood, that we rely on is related to how we conserve the fresh waters. But I would say in general, there's specific pockets where water quality is definitely improving and we're facing, and we're getting better at conserving and protecting the freshwater systems. But there's plenty of other cases where it's degrading and it's not getting any better, and there's no real plans to make it better. And oftentimes, of course, this is because humans are wanting to do human things, and that oftentimes involves creating big factories or resource centers that
And
are
all the
not that
plastic
great.
pollution and yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Definitely,
Yes.
definitely a lot of work to do. And so Zachary, for our listeners that of course love the environment and now I'm sure have fallen madly in love with crayfish, what is one or two simple things that you recommend they do that could generally help crayfish and the water systems they live in?
Yeah, so pretty much no matter where you live, if you live in North America, there's crayfish out there. Most humans around the world, there's crayfish out there in their ecosystems. Oftentimes, what I would recommend for people that are interested is because they rely on fresh water, there's oftentimes local agencies, local societies that do things like river cleanups, that monitor stream health in a very basic way. That's all very important information that can help conservation agencies and whatnot kind of do what they're trying to do in improving natural resources like fresh water. One of my other favorite things to suggest for people to do is, I'm sure many people are familiar with the platform iNaturalist.
I love
Essentially,
it.
it's a platform where everyday people and scientists go on and they do things like take photos of what they're finding out in nature, whether it's a plant, a mushroom, or a crayfish. Oftentimes, when you upload that online, then a professional or a scientist will observe those observations and confirm them. What this really does is gives us information on where these animals are at. I cannot tell you how much I rely on this for my own research. When I'm
So good.
planning a trip, oftentimes there's very bad information on what crayfish are out there. But if somebody flipped a rock in a stream and took a picture of a crayfish, that can tell me where to go, or that can show me there's something really interesting going on in this habitat. And so I think that's really important. And a lot of crayfish biologists and other biologists are really using iNaturalist to help inform their research. And it makes it a lot easier and better for um, people like me to do the jobs.
Yes, no, thank you for mentioning iNaturalist. I love the app. I think I downloaded it probably about a year and a half ago, and we do where I live, we'll do local challenges where we for a weekend to see how many species we can identify. And for our listeners out there, it of course it does invertebrates and bugs and but it does plant species as well, which for me is definitely one of my areas of weakness. I didn't grow up in Florida, so I'm always trying to learn about the local plants here more and more. And yeah, it's just great. I mean, it takes a picture of it, and it can help narrow down exactly what species, whether it's a plant or an animal or bug species you are or crustacean you're looking at. So I can't rave enough about it. And it was a really proud parenting moment. It was probably about a month ago. There was some cool looking bug, and my 4-year-old was like, Mom, give me your phone. I want to see what this is. And he doesn't know the app's name or anything, but he knew that that's how, at that age, I mean, 4 is pretty little, that there's this cool tool that you can use to identify. And of course, I grew up, I'm old enough where we had, and whenever I would travel to Central or South America or Africa, I had the book with all the species in it,
Hmm.
and trying to see what I could identify from either my photos or with my binoculars. But this is way easier. and,
Yeah.
and it gives you real-time quick information. So yes, I love that. And I love that real scientists and biologists like you are actually using it as well to help get information. And it's all about, we talk a lot about on the podcast about citizen science. So awesome. That is a great thing that, like you said, anybody can do. And then in the community, you can find local challenges that'll get you outside and looking at nature. And it's just it's a great thing. So I really appreciate that. Uh, and Zachary, for people listening to this podcast, or hopefully for people that will check out your book, which here I'm going to pitch and at the end of the podcast, and then also put it in our show notes and on social media. But what do you hope that listeners that maybe haven't really thought a lot about crayfish, either before listening to this podcast or before hopefully reading your book, what is one thing that you hope they carry with them moving forward about crayfish?
Yeah, I think if I had to choose one aspect of, really kind of my mission as a crayfish biologist, it's trying to educate people on their diversity. You can't appreciate or care or want to protect something if you don't know it exists. If you think crayfish are just, if you think it's a single species, they're all brown, they're all boring, they all live in the mud, I understand why you wouldn't care about them. But once you
Right.
start to learn about their diversity, once you start to learn their stories and the people that are studying them, I think that gets people excited about these organisms because they are one of the most important organisms in North America. The organismal groups. I think they are like very American in just
Yeah.
their nature. I think it's a part of growing up in the United States oftentimes is having some experience with these organisms, whether you're catching them, eating them, fishing with them. It's like a true American experience. And I kind of like that they're a good representative for that. And so I love teaching people about their diversity and showing people why they should care about them.
Well, and you definitely did a great job teaching us today about that little blue crayfish that lives up near you in Pittsburgh in the woods. Like, if I told that to my boys right now, that there was, are there any blue or brightly colored terrestrial crayfish in Florida?
There
Like, can
are,
they go?
yeah.
Oh,
Yeah,
oh,
there's a few,
okay.
more so in Georgia. There's one
Hmm.
specifically I've actually gone to on the panhandle of Florida, near, it's called it's called the fireback crayfish, Cambarus
Uh-huh.
pyronotus. It's
Okay.
probably related to the blue species all the way up in Pittsburgh, quite a long time ago, but it's bright red. It's bright red or bright orange, and it's in pretty restricted areas that are difficult to access. But there are very beautiful species in Florida. That's where a lot of early crayfish biology research was done, actually.
Oh, that's so cool. I can't wait to share it with my boys. And then in a week or two, my whole backyard will be, there'll be holes 10 feet down, but that's how we love it. I love sharing with them all the cool creatures because like you mentioned, there's always, there's ones that you can see or there's really iconic ones wherever you live. But yeah, if you either flip over a rock or look underground, there's definitely a lot more going on. And I appreciate you educating me today and our listeners. And we should all, care more about crayfish. And like you said, whether it's just from growing up with them or consuming them or studying them. But yeah, there's definitely a lot more that to learn about them. And your book does a great job sharing that information with us. And so hopefully for our listeners, that'll be a great way to share the book with people that they love and their families, and to get the conversation going about crayfish. Because you're right, if you would have asked me before I met you, "Oh, how many crayfish are there?" I probably species, I would have been like, "Oh, 30 or 40." And so it's really fun to share this information and get people excited about the diversity, let alone, I mean, how old they are from an evolutionary perspective, and they've been here much longer than us. So yeah, we really need to do a better job taking care of them and taking care of our waterways. And now, Zachary, if you could just my last question or two, if you could just uh give advice to anybody listening to this podcast, any future students that maybe would like to study crayfish or just in general love wildlife like ourselves, what advice would you give them for somebody that wants to study another cool, unique creature?
Yeah, I would say one of my favorite things to do in the past and currently is whenever I'm interested in something, whether it's crayfish, whether it's, some bird that only lives in, a remote region of, Kazakhstan or something crazy, is if you find the experts who have some knowledge on that, people like me love talking about their research. And so I've reached out to so many random people and I'm just like, hey, do you know anything about this? What are your thoughts on this? And they'll often
Yeah,
give me very detailed,
yeah,
responses, and they'll take the time out of their day to respond to me. So I think that's something like, don't be afraid to reach out to anyone that has some
yeah.
expertise and are oftentimes willing to help. And so that's something that I've always done. I've always shot blind emails and I've been very surprised on who's responded. And then if you're interested in crayfish specifically, and how to study crayfish or any of these other animals, you really got to dedicate yourself. It helps to build like a little bit of background knowledge by doing your own research, by using iNaturalist and finding what crayfish are in your region. And there's a lot of places in the United States and beyond that have biologists that are studying these organisms. And so, again, just kind of reach out to them and, pick their brain or see if they're taking undergraduate or master's students, for example, if you're looking for it in a more formal education. I kind of recommend all of that.
No, I think that's super solid advice, because oftentimes I get students that are not super comfortable with like the cold call email. And I'm like, look, you gotta make it professional, but definitely you have to reach out there to people that are doing the things that you think you maybe want to do or have the expertise. And a lot of times, I just even put like I encourage them to put like a little safety sentence in there, and if something like, yeah, if you're not the right person to help with this question, or if you don't, if you're too busy or you don't have time, is there anybody else you recommend that I could talk to about this? So sometimes, in that'll even broaden your net of people that you can reach out to too. So there's yeah, it's a it's a good thing to learn to be comfortable being uncomfortable. And you might get 10 no's. I mean, I got a lot of no's before I got accepted to grad school. Thanks, Chris. Uh, but I got a lot of no's before, and it's not fun, but it's also okay. It's part of it, and it helps shape my journey. And so, yeah, it's an important skill set that not everyone is comfortable doing. So if you're an animal nerd like us, find other animal nerds wherever you go, and you'll definitely be a better person for it. So, and like as Zachary mentioned, like we love it. Like I love when people reach out to me on the podcast and send me a picture or tell me your story. I'll get back to you whenever I can, or put you in touch with other people that I might know in the field. So Yeah, it's all about the networking. So that's great. Solid advice. Thank you. And now, Zachary, your book, Crayfish, Crawfish, and Crawdads, the biology of the biology and conservation of North America's favorite crustacean, is going to be released in early January, correct? Is it January 6th, 2026?
Yeah, yeah, it should be out very early January. You can pre-order copies now, really anywhere you can buy books. Barnes& and Noble, Amazon, the website of UNC Press, which is the publisher. All of those have pre-order available right now.
That is awesome. Well, I'm definitely looking forward to my copy early January, which will be super exciting so I can nerd out more about crayfish. And then I'll probably have to do another interview to ask you even more in-depth nerdy questions. Because as we're talking, I'm like, wow, how do they breathe? And what's their courtship behavior?
Yeah,
But that
we could get into that part too.
yeah, but that's science, right? Like you get one or two questions answered and then it makes you think more. You're like, okay, well then if this is the case, then what about that? Or you might answer one question and then get 10 more. Or you don't answer your question, you come up with a new question. And to me, that's why it's such a fun area to study with science and biology and animals and behavior. Yeah, we could definitely talk all day. But for our listeners out there, we'll keep it a little short today. And I was hoping you either had some social media platforms or something that you could share with our listeners or that I could put on our social media platforms.
Yeah, so I do have an Instagram where I post photos of the crayfish that I collect and study. I think that's one thing that's kind of missing is some, gallery of photos of these really
Hmm.
unique species. And so on
Sure.
Instagram, it's crayfish, crawfish, crawdad is actually my Instagram.
Nice.
So you could just find it right on there. And then also on Instagram and on Facebook, the lab that I West Liberty University Crayfish Lab, we also have a page where we post updates on student research and projects that we're doing. And it's a great place to kind of just see what it's like to be a crayfish biologist, both as a professor, but also an undergraduate or master's student. So there's a lot of information on there as well.
Well, awesome. I will definitely be getting in touch with you through social media and we'll be sharing your platforms on our page as well and on the show notes for the podcast. And for our listeners out there, do yourself a favor, pre-order or when it's out, if you're listening to this podcast after January 6th, 2026, go out and check out and purchase Dr. Zachary Graham's Crayfish, Crawfish, and Crawdads, the biology and conservation of North America's favorite crustaceans. So I think it'll definitely be a winner and you're going to learn a lot, which is always fun for all of us animals lovers out there. So thank you, Zachary. I appreciate your time today and getting me all excited about crayfish. I will never look at them the same. And now I want to learn more about what species are in Florida, get my kids involved, utilize iNatural. It's iNaturalist, right?
Hmm.
Yeah. Utilize iNaturalist to help find them. And yeah, definitely give you a follow on social media so I can stay inspired by all your cool photos. So
Great. Yeah. Thank
thank
you for having me. I'm very, very glad to sit here and talk about crayfish.
Awesome. Well, thank you everyone for listening, caring, and sharing. And a big, huge thank you to Dr. Zachary Graham today for being on the podcast with us. Thank you. Bye bye.